Hi, I'm Alan Roach, and I'm here to talk to you today about animals. The animals that I want to talk about are animals that you know and animals that you don't know, animals that exist and some animals that don't exist. This animal over here is the quokka, an animal that maybe you do know and maybe you don't. Maybe it exists and maybe it doesn't. Here are some zebras that are in a zoo, and any animal in the zoo is an animal that is both real and imaginary. It's in a created space and it's presenting itself in a natural way. Believe it or not, these three posteriors are arranged the way that they would be in the wild. This is the animal that I want to talk to you about, and this is the Sukhothero. And for as much as anybody knows, this animal never existed. And I spent a lot of time studying the Sukhothero. We'll look at the animal and see why it existed for such a long time in the literature. You see reproductions of it. This one is from 1820, for decades, if not centuries. So when we look at animals like this hippopotamus, we think, okay, we know the animal. But of course, we don't really know the animal. This is not what a hippopotamus really looks like. It doesn't walk on the water. It doesn't have teeth like this. And it certainly doesn't grab alligators by the tail and flail them around all the time. But it's recognizable. It's a product of our imagination and a product of reality. Now, by contrast, this salamander over here is very real. A picture that was taken for Natural History magazine, and is presenting itself in this very odd posture called unken, which shows its yellow parts to scare away predators. It's real, but in some sense it defies imagination. Now, when we think about other kinds of animals, we see that they have very bizarre coloration that defies credulity. Some of you may recognize this, and if it's an anole lizard, and if you have ever seen one, it can swell its throat out to be very, very bright red. We know that. We see it. And sometimes we actually see them in the wild, as I saw this one. But coloration and bizarre coloration is something that we speculate about. It comes out of our imagination. So when I was a child and I looked at dinosaurs, the dinosaurs I saw were big and green and lumpy and very, very drab. But those are not the dinosaurs of today. The dinosaurs of today are flashy, colorful, dynamic. Is this what they look like? We can speculate, but there's not an enormous amount of evidence for that. But we still like the idea of it. And for those of us who remember the old illustrations, this is the product of a new kind of imagination. So, other animals come up in culture that have a certain kind of function. And that one of those animals is this, the eagle. It's not just an animal, it is a political animal. It is a representation of American culture. By the same token, there's another animal, a rodent, with which we're probably less familiar, at least some of you. I'm very familiar with it as it's my native animal, and that's the beaver. Still, it's not just an animal. It's an animal that's on coinage. It's an animal that's on flags, on signs, and it is not just a beaver, but it is a Canadian beaver, just as the eagle was an American eagle. So, thinking about animals in this light is worth thinking about in very concrete terms. Here we have an animal that's easily recognizable. It's Albert Durer's rhinoceros, very much a real animal, and yet it bears no resemblance to an actual rhinoceros if we had one in front of us. No rhinoceros has that little horn right on top of it, beyond the ears, on its back. None have the plated armor, which is what Dürer used to create, on its stomach and belly. This is both the most realistic and most accepted representation of a rhinoceros, but also one of the most inaccurate. Now, here's an animal that we know for sure is real. At least I know for sure it's real because he jumps up on the bed with me all the time, and his name is Kramer. He is only 1 year old, and he walks around with his tongue hanging out. So, a very, very real animal, but also an unnatural animal who lives in a house, who lives alone, who is groomed, and who has this sense of himself that is different from what a wild dog would have. He knows that he's Kramer because he comes when called, or at least sometimes he does, but he doesn't know what Kramer means, and he doesn't know what's represented in his name. This is, again, what we do a great deal with animals. Now, I want to get back to the Sukhothero very, very briefly and show you this image of the Sukhothero, the bottom right-hand corner of the Travels of Johann Nijhoff, published in the 1680s. And Nijhoff was a Dutch explorer who was very much interested in showing you actual animals from his travels. So there's the Sukhothero blown up. It's right there on the title page of his work. So he's very serious about it and very committed to it. In fact, so committed that he provides 2 illustrations of it in his book. It's the only creature of which there are 2 illustrations. And we can see it's a little strange. I mean, the elephant in the background is an animal that's already familiar, so we see him from the tail end. It's not the best depiction of a trunk, but there's the Sukhothero with its very bizarre horns coming out of the side of its head, very bizarre eyes on a particular slant, along with other animals that may not look like themselves, but we know that one is supposedly a fox and a lynx. The other one is probably some kind of primate. So, here we go. Here is another depiction, more recent, of the Sukhothero. Sukhothero disappears sometime around 1830, 1840. Why? Why does an animal appear? Why do people think it exists? And why do they stop thinking it exists? For a long time, nobody thought its companion animal here, the platypus, ever existed, and yet we still know that it exists, and we still depict it, even though it really doesn't look anything like the platypus depicted here. This is the Sukhothero that I've lived with for about 30 years, and I want to tell you more about not only the Sukhothero, but animals like it that we think we know, that we think are real, but aren't really real. And to close, I'll give you Bigfoot, which is not real, but of course is as real as it can possibly be, given that we've been watching it on the screens for the last 20 years. Thanks a lot.